Okay, so let's talk about some NASCAR rules today. More specifically, NASCAR's enforcement of a particular rule and their inconsistency with it. That rule is referred to as the 100% rule. Now, because NASCAR doesn't actually publish their rule book to the public, I can't actually look up the exact wording of this rule like I would be able to for F1, but it essentially states that competitors are required to drive with 100% of their ability to try and achieve the best finishing position for themselves. Following the race at Charlotte, NASCAR penalized Cole Custer $100,000 and 50 points. Stuart Haas was also docked 50 owners points, while crew chief Mike Shiplett was also fined $100,000 and indefinitely suspended. The reason for the penalty is because in NASCAR's judgment, Custer intentionally slowed to allow teammate Chase Briscoe to gain more positions. On the radio, Custer was told that he had a flat tire and that he needed to slow. I find it hard to believe that the team would be able to see a flat tire, especially with the car on the back stretch, before the driver could feel it. If this was F1, I could understand it a bit more with all the sensors they have. I could see them seeing a slow leak before the driver could feel it, but this isn't F1. They don't have that kind of data available. I can agree with NASCAR that this fits that rule. It's usually not going to be 100% clear. There's going to usually be a bit of a gray area, but I think it's pretty obvious what happened. NASCAR Director of Competition Scott Miller said, quote, "While involvement of the radio and instruction over the radio that are or might even be construed as anything else, those are the things that you can't overlook. I mean, could we call it teamwork? Yeah, teams work together. They draft together. They do all kinds of things together and work as a team. But blatantly pulling over and changing the finishing order on the last lap is what makes it over the top, especially with instructions from the pit box." End quote. While I think Custer clearly broke the rule and deserves a penalty, I would also argue that he doesn't deserve a penalty, based on the history of the rule, and NASCAR allowing teams to break it without consequences. Example 1. 2021 at Bristol, when Chase Elliott had to pit after getting a flat tire after contact with Kevin Harvick. On the radio, Elliott said, "Where's the 5 at? I'll help him out." And then went out there, slowed down to slow down Kevin Harvick and get in his way to allow teammate Kyle Larson to win. On new tires, Elliott should have drove away from everyone, but he didn't. He went slow, not giving 100%. He plain as day said what he was going to do to help Larson, and then went out there and took out Harvick, who was racing Larson for the win. It's fine to help your teammate, but it's not fine if you're not giving 100%. Now example 2. Let's go back to 2020 at Martinsville. This was the cutoff race to set up the Final Four. Hamlin had started to struggle and was plus 1 point above the cut line. He was being chased down by teammate Eric Jones, who was then told on the radio to not pass Hamlin. If you're faster than a car ahead and are then told not to pass, and you then slow down and then don't pass that car, that is not giving 100%. But again, no penalty was issued. Here's the radio message that transpired with the 20 team that day. This was with 15 laps to go. Crew Chief Chris Scale: "Hamlin is going to race you hard because he needs to, because it's within like 3 points for those guys. He's going to race you hard because it's 3 points on those guys. Just so you are aware." Jones: "I've got a huge gap behind me." Spotter Rick Corelli: "Don't pass him, Jones. Stay with him and drive what you can." Now this was the end of the race. Jones: "Good car. Chris, I don't have much to say to you about the end. I'll talk to you when I get in there." Gale: "Yup, exactly." Scott Miller's comments on the Custer penalty further argue my case for Elliott and more specifically Jones, as it was his team that told Jones not to pass. With Elliott, it wasn't the team telling him, but he still clearly said over the radio he was going to help Larson, which means him going slower than he's capable of. I think all 3 of these examples are clear examples of drivers having violated the 100% rule. If NASCAR says Custer violated that rule, then given the other examples, how can you not say they did too? Elliott said he was going to help Larson, and plain as day did that at his own expense. Jones was told not to pass Hamlin in order to ensure Hamlin's advance, and Jones didn't pass, despite having been faster. Yet NASCAR's enforcement of these incidents has been different. The 100% rule was brought in after 2013 when Clint Bowyer was accused of intentionally spinning and Brian Vickers pitted to give up position to help teammate Martin Truex Jr. get into the chase. Ty Norris was a spotter for Brian Vickers in 2013. Norris had told Vickers over the radio that he needed him to pit for a point. This was the point to help get Truex into the chase. Norris was ultimately suspended by NASCAR. Norris commented on his suspension and the state of teams working together or with other teams to manipulate races and points. Quote, I applauded it. As mad as I was and still as mad as I am about it for our company, NASCAR had to do something. It was out of control. I watched people during the season pay for tires for a guy to come off because their guy had trouble. Pit, and I'll give you tires. There was so much conversation going on about what they could do for each other, it had to end. As mad as I was that I was the poster boy for it, you know it had to end, end quote. NASCAR penalized Michael Waltrip Racing heavily for this, despite not actually having a clear specific rule that they violated at the time. Although I do think most people would argue that it's wrong, but it's not against the rules if there isn't an actual rule to ban it. NASCAR actually penalized this incident worse than it has other incidents since creating this rule. Truex was removed from the chase as he benefited from it. Despite any evidence to say he knew about it, he was still removed. The 100,050 points are identical to Custer, which is the only instance that I can remember of a driver actually being penalized for this rule. I just don't understand how it makes sense to penalize a team more for something that most people do see as wrong, but not actually a violation of a rule, then leads to the creation of a rule, while then penalizing a team that violates that rule less. Nothing has changed from 2013 except that NASCAR added a rule to their rule book, but it doesn't matter how many rules you have when you choose not to enforce them. And NASCAR usually chooses to not enforce it, and so teams take advantage of that. And even if they do get a penalty, you could argue that it was worth it. The same exact issue with teams trying to manipulate races for points still exists. I guess you could say teams work more closely on this, keeping it within the same team now, but they still try to manipulate outcomes by working together. If a team thinks they're going to get away with something, they will try. The 50 points only moves Custer from 25th to 27th in points. Penalizing Custer, who was already out of the playoffs, doesn't really do much. If NASCAR wanted to take a more hardline stance on this, they need to penalize the driver that benefited from it, and that is Briscoe. Now, some will say Briscoe had nothing to do with it, and so that's not fair. Yes, that may be true. He probably wasn't involved. I don't think that Stewart-Haas had a whole team meeting before the race where they conspired to manipulate the race if given the opportunity. I think this was a decision made by Custer's team in the moment, but the problem is Custer only lost 2 positions in points when he's already in a position where it doesn't really matter where he finishes. The only real punishment is the indefinite suspension of Mike Shiplett. If NASCAR would penalize Briscoe, then other drivers and crews from within the same team won't put themselves in these positions because the risk is no longer worth it. NASCAR is also at fault, though, for their typical inconsistent enforcement of rules where only some rules apply only some of the time for only some people. I mean, NASCAR is not just the only racing series, but is the only sports league that I've ever seen review an incident, then issue a penalty, to then have their director of competition say it was an easy call and they obviously broke the rule, to then just an hour later rescind the penalty with no explanation. And for more context, you can check out my video on the 2020 Yellowwood 500 controversy. In the last 3 years, there has been 3 clear examples of drivers not giving 100%, while only one of those has been penalized. If Custer's was obvious with the radio message, then why wasn't Jones or Elliott's also clear? Both have clear radio messages of what they're going to do or are told to do by the team. Those incidents should have also been penalized. While Elliott's wasn't a team order issue, it still clearly fit into the 100% aspect of the rule. Formula One banned team orders following the 2002 season, but that didn't stop teams' orders from happening. With the most famous one being Ferrari at the 2010 German Grand Prix, where Rob Smedley, Felipe Massa's race engineer, came on the radio and said, "Fernando is faster than you. Can you confirm you understand that message?" With Massa then slowing to allow Alonso to pass. Following 2010, the FIA removed the ban on team orders as it was unenforceable. NASCAR needs to step up and at least be consistent with their enforcement over rules. This is not just limited to this rule. The yellow line rule is also officiated horribly inconsistent and is actually, in my mind, poorly enforced to the point of encouraging wrecking, which isn't okay. I would like to see much more transparency from NASCAR over issues, decisions, and rules, including a public rule book available and more explanation over their rulings. The problem is issues like this continue to feed NASCAR drama-filled approach to everything. With the playoffs, manipulating one race can be so advantageous to a team, as one race can have a huge impact on a season, it sometimes makes it worth it to try. Okay, so I was only going to talk about the Custer incident in this video, but due to several delays in making the video and recent actions, I thought I'd expand that. Bubba Wallace intentionally wrecked Kyle Larson at Las Vegas and was handed a one-race suspension. Okay, so one-race suspension for intentionally wrecking someone. Seems fair. But Noah Gragson didn't get a race suspension when he did the same exact thing to Sage Karam at Road America. He only got a $35,000 fine and was docked 30 points. So I compiled a list of the last 10 incidents that I could remember, along with ones that I could easily find where someone intentionally wrecked someone else. Here's a list of the punishments that went along with them. About the only thing consistent here, other than NASCAR being inconsistent, was NASCAR not doing anything. Of the 10 incidents, only 2 involved a race suspension, but they were different lengths. 2 had fines and points deductions. But again, they were different amounts. 2 of the 10 saw the driver parked, but again, the punishments were different. Edwards was parked for a race that only had a handful of laps left, while Kyle Busch was required to miss the Xfinity and Cup race that weekend. 3 of the 10 saw NASCAR not do a thing when somebody intentionally wrecks someone. The problem is, NASCAR sends different messages to teams and drivers every single time, with varying penalties, and even sometimes says it's totally cool to wreck someone because they don't do a thing about it. It is never okay for a driver to use a 3,400-pound race car as a weapon, but NASCAR hasn't done what's necessary for it to stop happening. One could argue that NASCAR makes these decisions based on the situation and the outcome, but that shouldn't matter. The question should be, did driver X intentionally wreck driver Y? Yes, okay, here's the consistent punishment for that. Not, driver X intentionally wrecked driver Y and then A, B, and C happened, so here's the penalty this time. The FIA used to include this in their stewards reports. Quote, in coming to the penalty, the stewards emphasize that they have only considered the incident itself and not the consequences thereof. End quote. Wallace probably got a race suspension because he took out Christopher Bell, a playoff driver. If he had only taken out Larson, he probably would have gotten a fine and a points deduction. But the consequences of his actions shouldn't matter. It's his actions to intentionally wreck someone that should. But if NASCAR wants to look at actions to make decisions, then let's do just that. Because then I would argue that Gregson's incident was worse because he took out over 10 other cars, and Brandon Brown was even looked to be physically bothered from the crash. Yet Gregson's penalty was the more lenient. You could also argue with my list going back to 2010 that time has changed how NASCAR enforces penalties, but the Wallace and Gregson's incidents that I've discussed both happened this year. How can I trust NASCAR to officiate a race when they couldn't even tell during the race that William Byron intentionally spun out Denny Hamlin under caution? Like, seriously, how do you miss that? With all the officials and cameras, I just don't get it. Like, it's unacceptable. Over the last couple of years, I've drifted away from NASCAR and gravitated towards other forms of motorsports. And so I feel very strong about issues like this. It's things like this that keep driving me away from the sport every time I turn back to watch a race. No other series or even any sports league in general has perfect officiating, but NASCAR continues to delegitimize themselves with inconsistent officiating all the time, fueled by a terrible points format that doesn't always reward the best driver, the championship. It only rewards drama. I could care less about the specific aspects of the rules and what might technically violate a rule as I do for consistency and what is typically considered a penalty and what isn't. If NASCAR can't consistently monitor team orders, then maybe they should take a page out of F1's book and allow team orders. Now, I'm not saying that's the perfect solution and what I'd prefer they do, but if you can't enforce it, then just allowing it to happen so everybody is on the same playing field and expects it could be better. If team orders were allowed, you would have to also axe the 100% rule, as it's impossible to have team orders, but then have a rule requiring a driver to always give 100%. NASCAR seriously needs to reevaluate their entire officiating system at this point, as it's just entirely inconsistent. So now, you've heard from me, now I want to hear from you. What are your thoughts on the Custer penalty? What do you think about the 100% rule? Should NASCAR change the penalty for violating this rule to punish the driver who benefits from it? What changes should NASCAR make to better officiate races? Thanks for watching, and until next time, so long, everybody.